Good morning, Lydia.
Good morning, Sarah.
I'm Sarah Posner, and this is The Posner Show. And my guest today is Lydia Bean. She is the author of the book, The Politics of Evangelical Identity. And she's also a strategist for the PICO National Network, which is the largest faith-based organizing network in the country. And they organize low and moderate income faith communities for racial and economic justice. And her book, which she undertook in her capacity as a sociologist, studies four evangelical congregations and takes a look at how these congregations built their conservative, Republican on the U.S. side, political identity. The four congregations are two congregations near Buffalo, New York, and two congregations across the Canadian border in Ontario. And on each side, one congregation was an evangelical congregation and the other one was a Pentecostal congregation. So it's a very fascinating read because it takes a very close look at the congregants in these churches and how they formed their political identity. And Lydia's main thesis is that the political identity of these conservative Republican evangelicals on the U.S. side did not come, as might be the stereotype, from the pastor standing in the pulpit and telling them to vote Republican or vote against the candidate who's for abortion or same-sex marriage, but rather from a more subtle building of political identity through lay leaders in the church, reinforced by parachurch organizations like Focus on the Family that played a role in how these people developed a political sensibility that was not necessarily focused on electoral politics, but was essential for the forming of their conservative political identity. Is that a good summary?
That's a great summary, yeah.
So let's talk about that a little bit. There were some other features of the book that I wanted to also get into. But first, let's talk a little bit about that. And because, you're very clear that obviously these non-electoral political conversations these non-electoral politics conversations are still political conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah.
So how does that work? So you're saying that they basically became amenable to a message that voting Republican is the only way to be a good American Christian,
Mm-hmm.
because they had built this political identity around these non-electoral political ideas.
Yeah. So one of the basic findings is that messages are not sacred if they are seen as explicitly partisan. So you can't go around saying, you have to vote Republican or else you're going to hell. That would be inappropriate, it would be unspiritual, and it would be unsacred. And the idea is that these ideas transcend politics. They're not just about, they stand above the dirty world of partisan politics.
Right.
And it's about this narrative of Christian nationalism. It's about spinning this narrative of Christian nationalism, that America is a Christian nation, that Christians need to be working together to restore this lost heritage. And that's the narrative that's being told 24/7, day in, day out. Mm-hmm. And so all you have to do is inject a little bit, at election time, you have to come around and beat the bushes and get out the vote. But that's not where the work happens. The work is in developing this narrative that's everywhere. And it's in the parachurch world. And, people could be doing things like praying for the president or praying for America. And these things are telling a narrative about how liberals basically destroyed America and how conservatives have to take it back. But they would not see that as a partisan narrative or political at all.
But how can they not see that as a partisan narrative? That's what I struggled to understand that. As I was reading your interviews with some of these people, it was like they were making, in some sense, a false distinction between what was political and what wasn't political.
Yeah, well, I think one of the reasons for that, I asked the same question myself, is that evangelicals still have not developed a public theology. I mean, there are some elites, like if you went to Harvard or Princeton, there's the Veritas Forum, and you have organizations in DC that are trying to develop an evangelical public theology. And I don't want to dismiss their important work, but at the grassroots level, I found that the evangelicals I was talking did not really have a public theology in the sense of like a really clear theory of change at how Christians would affect change in the public sphere without, imposing it. They weren't dominionists. They didn't believe in imposing a theocracy, but they didn't really have an account. The folk theory that I found was most common was this idea that change would kind of bubble up from the bottom from individual transformation. Mm-hmm. And to the degree that bubbling up effect was not happening, it was because liberals were willfully blocking the faith influence in public life. So the idea is that liberals would just get out of the way. We wouldn't even need politics because we can just save souls and change lives. And that will just kind of naturally work its way up through all levels of government and society and renew society.
So how would you explain to, say, a secularist that wasn't a theocratic sort of theory of the world?
Yeah, so from their perspective, they would say, well, this goes to this narrative of religious freedom. We have a freedom to share our faith, right, in the public schools and the workplace and in public life as leaders. And when you are always, being like, you secularists are always running around getting in our way, you were stopping us from freely proclaiming the gospel. And that's the reason why everyone hasn't been, converted already, and why this hasn't become like a de facto Christian nation where the individuals in it choose to embody Christian values and it percolates up.
Right. So it's more of a ground up than we need to have a Christian government. Did you hear a lot of that in these the churches on the U.S. side? Because I think that something that you hear in Christian right electoral politics, overtly electoral politics, is that we need to elect godly leaders so that we can have a government that's based on biblical values or Judeo-Christian values, whatever the language is that they're using at that particular time. But you're saying that these folks that you talk to saw it more of something that would bubble up from the grassroots, and then you wouldn't have to worry so much about whether we were electing godly people to government.
Yeah, well, there was a lot of confusion. I mean, there was a lack of public theology. There's a lot of conflicting ideas. But the idea of the godly leader is the most common. You get the right people into office. There's not a real thought about what the regime is into which these people fit, right? So evangelicals, white evangelicals, traditionally in the United States have a history of not thinking about the structural dynamic at all. So you just think about individuals. Yeah, Christian Smith and Michael Emerson call it anti-structuralism. This idea of thinking of society as just the composition, it's composed of the individuals that make it up. There's nothing above the individual and the relationships that are around them.
Right. I see. That makes sense. I mean, I've certainly in my work, I've encountered people who believe that and don't necessarily think that much about how to structure a political movement or a public policy that, they sort of rely on all of this happening from good Christians doing their part in society.
Yeah, I've had many conversations with people. They say, why can't we just get godly people in office and then we can just, they'll just make just and reasonable and kind decisions, And there's not this understanding that the institution itself or the democratic regime itself would have its own logic that has to be figured out.
That's interesting. Speaking of, liberals being the problem, basically, right? You yourself had some interesting encounters in basically justifying yourself to them in your work. They wanted very much, even you were raised Baptist. So, you're a religious person, you're a Christian too, but it seemed like a number of these people that you spoke with and that you interviewed had a lot of questions about whether you were the quote unquote right kind of Christian. And they were skeptical about you and I guess whether they could trust you to tell their story.
Yeah, and that's very understandable. The people that were part of my research were very hospitable, but of course, I had to have some conversations with leaders in the church, especially in the American churches, that protecting the flock. They're like, it's not that we don't trust you; we just need to protect the flock. And I can certainly understand. I mean, I was sitting in small groups. I was in Sunday school classes, right, listening to some very personal conversations. So,
right.
especially in the American churches, they really had to sit me down and figure out what kind of person are you.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. In the Canadian churches, there were really no questions asked. I mean, of course, they were interested in knowing where I was coming from,
Sure.
but there wasn't. And I think part of it is that Canada is such a secular society. There aren't people who just go around saying, yeah, I'm Christian, and just saying that so easily unless they're pretty serious. It's just not, it's a much more privatized religious culture.
Right.
So they didn't really have many questions. But yeah, in both American churches, and it was weird because, it's actually really hard to explain, am I an evangelical? I don't know, so I grew up in a very unique family culture that's kind of straddles the boundaries of evangelicalism and mainline Protestantism.
Yep.
So, they spent the whole time trying to figure out what I was. And I don't know that I could give them a convincing answer.
Well, did they want to know whether you had read the Bible, whether you had a personal relationship with Christ? Were these the types of questions that they asked you?
Yeah, definitely.
And if you had been a secular person, if you had answered those questions that, you hadn't really read the Bible and you didn't grow up a Christian, do you think that there would have been a lower level of trust?
It would have been a very different study. I've read some really great ethnographies written by secular people or people from other religious faiths who study evangelicalism.
Right.
And they, many of them were able to establish rapport and do really interesting work. But as I said in my appendix, it would have told you something about how evangelicals navigate social situations when they are in the room with someone that they are trying to evangelize. I mean, that's what you would learn, right?
Right.
It wouldn't be a study of how evangelicals do boundary work when they're surrounded by sort of in-group insiders.
Right.
And so I think this is a study of how evangelicals talk to other evangelicals. And I tried to get this across in my book that sometimes I think people were more open with sharing some of their anger or frustrations with non-Christians with me because they knew I would understand where they were coming from. If I had been a secular person, I don't think they would have shared that with me because they would have worried about hurting my feelings.
Oh, interesting. So they weren't, you would think that they would be more worried about hurting your feelings than expressing this discontent with secularism.
Yeah, because
it would seem too combative.
Yeah, it would seem too combative, and there's this concern. I mean, evangelicals spend a lot of time thinking about how they can express a loving witness to people outside the faith. Yeah. And so that prioritizes over expressing your own feelings. Like, you have a responsibility to not be a jerk, even if you have these thoughts, right?
Okay, well that's a good segue into something else that I wanted to talk about, which was the chapters that you did on the American congregation's treatment of the abortion and same-sex marriage issues, because I think that you focused a great deal on, some interesting conversations about same-sex marriage or just, gay rights in general. And also on the abortion issue, it was, and I have found this too. And I think that there's a place where I think, it would be, I think that people would differ on whether to describe what they're talking about as a compassionate view or not.
Yeah.
So, you know what I'm saying? Because, you described how they wanted to be compassionate and loving and not combative with people who, in their phrasing, were struggling with homosexuality or struggling with the same-sex attraction. And I think for a lot of people, the notion of calling it struggling is itself a loaded word that implies that there's something wrong with it, that you have to struggle with it, like you would struggle with alcoholism or something like that. And
that's very much the analogy that's being made.
Right. And similarly on the abortion issue, the idea that women who had or were considering having an abortion were people that needed to be treated with love and compassion, but it sort of framed in this way that, like, you had done something or you were considering doing something that was wrong, right?
Oh,
so
yeah.
So again, like, it's framed in this compassionate language, yet for an outsider, that compassionate language can seem not so compassionate. I mean, is there, and I think that a lot of what you were writing about went to the issue of, well, not every anti-same-sex marriage evangelical is standing on the street and yelling about sodomites and the gay agenda and everything else, and not every anti-choice evangelical is throwing blood at fake blood at an abortion clinic or something like that. Right. And but I think that also it goes to that divide in the use of language and whether it's actually political or not. So like is calling that sort of discussion of homosexuality or abortion compassionate, like that in itself is sort of like a political way of talking about it nonetheless. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And that was those were hard chapters to write because I wanted to really convey my research participants on their own terms. Yeah. And so there were often places where I didn't, when I use the term compassion or loving, I'm rephrasing their own language. Right. And there were many times at which I might have used quotation marks, but I also didn't want to be sarcastic either. Yeah. Sometimes quotation marks can be sarcastic, and I really just wanted to let it speak for themselves. But yeah, that's the irony, this language of compassion. But I think one of the reasons it's important to understand it is it tells you why white evangelical conservatives don't recognize themselves in the mirror that secularists are holding up for them, right? So you might say liberals are holding up this mirror saying, this is how you look, you hateful jerks. Right. You're making women feel bad about the medical choices they're making. You're, making people feel ashamed of the way they were born. Don't you feel ashamed of yourselves? And what I think my ethnography shows is evangelicals look at that image and say, that's not me. That's not us at all. You've got it all wrong. You're the one spinning that hateful portrait that's not based in reality. Because they, in their own churches, do not hear that kind of explicitly angry language that's very anti-gay, very sort of militant, kind of comparing homosexuality to bestiality and incest. They don't hear that in their churches, so they're saying you're stereotyping us and we're the victims of being, unjustly defamed. Right. We're not bigoted. We're trying to tell you this loving message that God didn't intend for you or doesn't want you to be gay. But one of the other ironies of that is that turn is very new and very real. So one of the interesting things is that compassionate language may feel sort of like a Trojan horse to secularists. They may say, well, this is just you trying to not seem bigoted. Right. But people in these churches actually, this is new, and this is, they feel it as emancipatory because they grew up in a culture where homosexuality could not be spoken of at all, or the language is extremely condemning. So for them, it's like, oh, that's right. We do need to be compassionate and loving. And if you are yourself gay and evangelical, it may seem like very a big relief to know, there is a place for me. There's a place for me in my struggle in the subculture that I was raised that I value so much. Right. So while we're on the topic of LGBT rights and same-sex marriage, there was a part of the book where you were talking about this reinforcement of the political identity through the churches and through the lay leaders of the church and the parachurch organizations, and you debunk the very sort of commonly disseminated statistic that younger evangelicals are becoming more supportive of gay rights and marriage equality. They are. But you do take issue with sort of a blanket, this sort of blanket shift, because you talk about how the evangelical culture is still reinforcing a lot of the language and shaping their concept of what homosexuality is, theologically speaking. And can you talk? So they are shifting their views, but it's more of a, well, we think this is the right thing to do. It's fair and just that same-sex couples should be allowed to get married. But are they still retaining some of this
some of the culture about cultural views of homosexuality nonetheless.
Oh, yeah. So actually, this turned into a separate research paper that I ended up exploring more with my graduate student, Brandon Martinez at Baylor.
Uh-huh.
And we went into the survey data with and what we found was that we were interested in this phenomenon. I saw it in the churches that I studied. Brandon Martinez, as a former evangelical pastor, had seen it in his congregations.
Uh-huh.
And so we were interested in this phenomenon of growing support for civil rights for gay and lesbian couples, but within a morally traditional framework. And we found, reviewing the literature, that actually a lot of the increase in support for LGBT rights actually comes from morally traditional people. So people who still say homosexuality is morally wrong. And that's particularly true among evangelicals. So we have this weird finding that you have a pretty large group of evangelicals who, across all age groups, it's not just young people, who continue to say that homosexuality is morally wrong, but support civil unions. So not
civil
marriage,
unions,
but civil
not
unions.
marriage,
Yeah.
because they still hold to the idea that marriage is a biblical idea that can't be altered.
Yes. But I think what it shows you is that the opposition to gay marriage among evangelicals is actually not popular. So you may have people who say, yes, it's morally wrong, but they're not willing to, basically die on that hill at all. And they have a great deal of ambivalence because there is this countervailing argument about fairness, treating people the same, treating people respectfully, being compassionate. And interestingly enough, that's a language that's coming from within evangelical discourse, right? This hearkening back to this, this controversial language of compassion. Well, one of the flip sides of this language of compassion is that, people say, well, is it compassionate to not give people the same civil rights to marry just because you disagree with your lifestyle? So then it becomes this, within evangelicalism, it's become sort of this acid eroding opposition to same-sex marriage because people just don't want to be bullies.
Right. And so now what we have, now meaning this week, we have the Supreme Court declining to hear the appeals from the Courts of Appeals, striking down the same-sex marriage bans in a number of states.
Yeah. Oklahoma, dude.
Right. And Virginia and Utah. And of course, the instant it happened, my inbox was filled with press releases from Christian right organizations decrying this, just in all kinds of bombastic and basically uncompromising language. But, if you could time travel back to your congregations that you were studying several years ago, do you think that sort of reaction to the Supreme Court's action would resonate with them?
You mean just like completely, this is the end of the world, we're all going to die, we're all going to get locked up and put on a concentration camp, this kind of rhetoric?
Maybe not the rhetoric that's that far, but, the black-robed justices, the undemocratic nature of the Supreme Court's action that's against Christian values and goes against the Bible, and it shows that, Christians are under siege in the United States by these undemocratic institutions that are foisting this secularist ideology on us.
I heard that rhetoric because it was already starting to heat up, right? It was 2006, 2007, right? That's when this all was beginning.
Right.
It unraveled very quickly. And I think what I heard was this language that there's a zero-sum game between gay rights and evangelical religious freedom. So the more that gay marriage becomes accepted, the more it will become permissible to discriminate against Christians who have morally traditional views. And that was the rhetoric that, not that they're going to put us in camps, but that they're going to start arresting pastors for saying that homosexuality is wrong. They're going to start taking away our tax status because we won't perform same-sex marriages. That was definitely the rhetoric. And still is. What I would add is that there is a divide between the interests of advocacy groups and the sort of interests and priorities of churches. And that's, as you know, a major theme of my book. Right. But advocacy groups, Christian right advocacy groups, I mean, I don't want to cast aspersions on their motives, but the fact is that if same-sex marriage becomes settled law across the country, which it is, in fact, as you see today, they are going to lose a lot of money in donations because once the battle is lost, there's really no need for them to exist. And basically, abortion and religious freedom become their big issues. And this has been, I mean, same-sex marriage, evangelicals started fighting gay rights before they were even opposed to abortion, right? So think of this. Back when evangelicals were pro-choice or divided on the issue of abortion, which is a time no one can remember, they were already mobilizing against gay rights. And so this is, in a sense, at the end of an era for them. And it's not surprising because these advocacy groups are just fighting for their right to exist and their purpose and their need to fundraise.
Yeah, right.
Because
exactly.
there's no need, once the battle's lost, they have no sort of nothing to mobilize their donors around.
Right. I guess, I mean, they can continue to mine the religious freedom issue with regard to marriage equality. But, you know, I mean, in the states where marriage equality was accomplished via legislation, you know, the law, you know, specifically exempts churches, you know, from having to be required to perform same-sex ceremonies, which seems sort of, you know, obvious anyway. I mean, like you can't go into a Catholic church and demand that a priest marry a Buddhist couple, right?
Yeah.
So, but anyway, that's. I mean, I agree. It's definitely the end of an era, but I still think that there are issues that they'll be able to fundraise around. I mean, I think that you know, public education is one of them. I think they're very and. School prayer, school choice. But I think that, you know, maybe they've lost the gay agenda bogeyman, maybe. But they certainly haven't lost the secularist bogeyman.
Oh, no, that bogeyman is still very much around.
Right. And probably even more so in their mind than before.
Yeah. And of course, abortion. That's not going away anytime soon.
Exactly.
I mean, there's no change. If anything, younger evangelicals are more pro-life than their older counterparts.
Well, let's talk about economic issues, because one of the really fascinating things to me in the book was your comparison of how the Canadian evangelicals viewed a government-provided safety net compared to American evangelicals. Now, you know, I think that it's commonly known that American white evangelicals are economic conservatives, and in many cases they see, you know, the New Deal, the war on poverty, Obamacare, you know, as part of a satanic, I'm not exaggerating, regime to, you know, for the government to like impose, you know, communist ideas on America, communist anti-Christian ideas on America. And, but you compared the views of a government social safety net of the American evangelicals to the ones in Canada, and you found something very, very different. And so it seems like the economic conservatism isn't inherent to evangelicalism. It's inherent in a way to American white evangelicalism.
No, very much. I mean, it took a lot of work to get white evangelicals to hate big government. It took a lot of work. And, you know, there were years where, you know, there was an attempt to get Southern Democrats, you know, Southern white evangelicals to you know, turn on the Democratic Party and the party of the New Deal, and they wouldn't do it because white evangelicals in the South were still poor. Yeah. You know, and so they weren't interested. No thanks. We like the New Deal just fine.
So what turned that?
It took a lot of work. There was in the 1940s, you know, of course, there was always the anti-communist rhetoric, right? The John Birch Society and the
Carl McIntyre. And,
we have to onward Christian soldiers. We have to fight the communist threat. Right. But in spite of that, I mean, Democrats were anti-communist too, so often that was a very nonpartisan thing. So there was an active effort to kind of link small government conservatism with religious faith and moral traditionalism. And it took a few years to make it stick. And Some of the early efforts were pretty wooden and about as awkward as early Democratic efforts to reach out to moral values voters. You remember like 2008, like
Yes.
2004 to 2008, it was like, I also have moral values.
Yeah.
You know?
We'll get to that in a minute.
Yeah. But that was kind of that on the conservative side. It took them a while to get it right. And so what happens is economic conservatives, sort of Iran types, realized they needed a group to ally with them, and evangelicals might be that group. And so there were a lot of wealthy philanthropists, businessmen who made a long-term investment in evangelicalism, in evangelical universities, parachurch ministries, churches, you name it. And they forged this new narrative of Christian nationalism that we now know as sort of mainstream, that basically blamed the decline of Christian values on the growth of the welfare state. The idea that the bigger the welfare state grows, the more it attacks the family, the more it erodes, Christian values.
But this was driven more by business interests than by theology.
Yeah. Economic conservatives initiated the marriage, right? Because at the popular level, I mean, evangelicalism has always been what Darren Jochuk calls plain folk religion, right? Yeah. It's the people's faith. And so there was never a very elaborate social justice theology in the evangelical tradition, but there was a very populist spirit, the dignity of the working man, working family. That rhetoric was very common, even when it was marred by racism, right? As among white evangelicals, they did have a sense of social justice if it was just us. You see what I'm saying, right?
Yes.
And it took a long time to undo that, and it was very much initiated by economic conservatives.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And so that did not happen on the Canadian side. And of course,
No.
in Canada, they have, during the Obamacare fights, a lot of conservatives, would point to Canada as being the scary place where they have, socialized medicine. But you found that the Canadian evangelicals liked that very much.
Oh, they love their socialized medicine. I mean, it's really funny. And more so, it's just seen as a basic fact of human dignity. Like, well, how could you? Healthcare is a human right. It's only decent. Like, what? And one of the more interesting interviews I did, in the American side, I was asking these questions. Why? Should the government reduce differences between rich and poor? And what was one of the more interesting parts of the research was asking that question to Canadians. They just looked at me like, are you stupid? Are you immoral? Like, why would you ask such a stupid question? I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but it was just it was like, of course, that's obvious. That is totally just foundational to, being a human person.
Right. That's so fascinating. Because I think that it just shows so vividly how this was a creature, as you say, of American political organizing that did not happen on the Canadian side, and it's not something that's innate to evangelical theology. So let's use that as a transition to talk about something that you mentioned, that you talk about in the book a little bit, and that is, does this provide any lessons for organizers of progressive faith communities, particularly people who are organizing faith communities for political action? You mentioned just a couple of minutes ago sort of the wooden efforts by Democratic candidates to reach out to faith communities after the so-called values voters triumph of 2004. And you saw Democratic candidates, talking very earnestly about their faith, or using religious language in speeches, or hiring campaign staff to reach out to faith communities, but not necessarily, it was just basically, vote for our guy because he's not the nasty conservative guy. And do you think that it lacked a certain identity formation, or did it lack having that base of identity formation that you talk about the white evangelical community having such a strong identity formation that basically lent itself to them seeing themselves as political conservatives and economic conservatives.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things, is that the site for that identity formation is not political campaigns. Because, I mean, one of the things we know, best practices in GOTV and political mobilization, is that when you're in campaign mode, people's, pardon my French, their BS detectors turn on.
Yeah.
And so people are very suspicious of that values language. If that's the first time they're hearing it from anywhere, they're like, oh, yeah, I'm sure you love Jesus. Great.
Yeah.
It's like, doesn't everybody when it's election time?
Right, exactly.
And so campaigns are not the right time to start that kind of language.
It's too late if you're starting at that point.
It's too late. People's BS meters and their existing partisan identities are already activated.
Yeah.
And in the case of political conservatives, back in the 60s, when conservatives thought they might be in a perpetual winter, they actually were very proactive about thinking long-term and movement building and base building. And they did a really great job. In the 70s and 80s, the Christian right, if anything, did an amazing job of developing a broad-based grassroots leadership structure.
Right.
And that's one of the things, I'm not saying it was right, but I'm saying it was well done, well played. Yeah. And we would be stupid to think that we could undo that legacy just by throwing some money into ads or like hiring a few consultants to do messaging.
Right.
You'd have to have your own ground game that was, at least a tenth of the size of the Christian right.
Right. I mean, and do you think, though, do you think there's an appetite for that in progressive faith communities in the United States? I mean, you probably can see it in the kind of work that you do now. Is there an appetite for that?
Well, I think the most common effort that has been done is this idea to create a religious left. And the idea is we need our own faith voices who will stand up and say, a real Christian, a real person of faith is pro-choice and LGBT friendly. And I think that's been done. I think those investments have been made. I think the less common, but what we know from survey research is the largest demographic opportunities for reaching out to faith voters are among people who are what you might call morally traditional populists. So people who oppose same-sex marriage, who might be pro-life, but that may not be their first choice issue. They may be more concerned about economic and racial justice.
Right.
That's a very large portion of Americans. It's a plurality. So it's like a lot of African-American voters, still very morally traditional, but they don't put that first in their voting. A lot of Latinos, right? And a lot of blue-collar Anglos. That's what we call white people in Texas, by the way.
Yeah. I got that.
Yeah. So a lot of blue-collar white Anglos fall into that category too. That's where the real gains are going to be made. Because the religious left, well, they're already accounted for. It's not like they were going to stay home, right? You're talking about some very educated, traditional liberals who just happen to go to their Episcopal church sometimes, right? Well, we already, those folks, there's only so many of them out there. And in a place like Texas, that's not going to take us to power. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Right.
You really have to be reaching deep into blue-collar, white, African-American, and Latino people of faith. And last time I checked, the Episcopalians weren't church planting heavily among blue-collar Latinos. Maybe they have some initiative I haven't heard about. So the action is all evangelical and Catholic.
Yeah.
And I haven't seen some heavy investments in talking to people who are pro-life about economic justice. In faith language that is more, I guess, stereotypically conservative. That's where the real opportunities are.
And so by stereotypically conservative, you mean what?
I mean, theologically, I think theologically not speaking the traditional religious left language. The theological resources of the religious left is pretty thin and basically based in kind of nostalgia for the civil rights movement. I mean, that's what you see is kind of the weak rule. And the civil rights movement was awesome, but we need to have a new language for a new faith movement for today.
And you think that would be centered on economic justice issues?
Yes. Because, I mean, both because I think that there's a stronger case to be made for that in our faith traditions. I mean, it's really hard to mobilize people of faith who are, besides that really thin group of liberals who are pro-choice all the way and go to church. That's a very small group of people. Most faith voters are at best ambivalent about abortion. And so they may not be voting, against self-interest on that basis, but it's not going to get them off their couch. That's not their issue.
Right.
And that's certainly not the issue for talking to low-income and working-class Latinos in Texas.
So the Democratic Party's war on women strategy is not going to win over these voters.
No.
And they can't win them over with some kind of superficial faithy talk, to simultaneously do the war on women talk and then bring out the faith talk for these voters who aren't reacting to the war on women rhetoric.
Yeah,
That's not going to cut it.
Rhetoric, no, not at all. I mean, I might respond to the war on women rhetoric because I'm a privileged, educated white woman.
Right.
But I feel like what's missing from all this women mobilizing is blue collar women. Because when you're talking about blue collar voters who are really responsive to progressive messages, you're talking about women, especially in the South. Men are a lost cause. Men are a harder sell. Mm-hmm. It's hard to be a progressive blue-collar white man in Texas. Like, I have friends and they tell me horror stories about, harassment at work and things like that. You're really talking about women. And those women are speaking at a very different voice from the, educated, feminist, self-conscious, progressive women that are kind of driving progressive messaging.
Right. Interesting. So what kind of is there a faith-based economic justice message that you think would resonate with blue-collar voters?
Yeah. I mean, here's my shameless pitch, but I'm a strategist for the PICO National Network, and we've developed that message. And it's not like we had to go into a lab and create it. It was a message that came from relationships with real live blue-collar faith communities. And it's the message they created for themselves. We know it'll resonate because it's their message to themselves, right? So I think that's a much more promising strategy, is to develop messages that are actually come out of the lives of faith communities. In the same way that the Christian right, even though it was in some ways engineered from the top down, it also came from being rooted in this rich life of congregations and small groups and parachurch ministries and, prayer groups. And so it had that authenticity because it was informed by the leaders who were actually embedded in those contexts.
Right. So what is that economic message, the faith-based economic message?
First of all, it's focused much more on the dignity of work rather than on helping people. I think that's one problem, is that when progressives mobilize to protect the safety net, they're basically speaking from this place of we're the social workers, we're coming to save you.
Yeah.
And surprise, surprise, working people don't respond to that. Amazing, right? That's not compelling or winsome. And it tends to be very wonky, very fast. But when you are telling a faith story from the perspective of working people, it's focused very much on the dignity of work. And, and what's funny is that conservatives have actually done a better job of telling that story of the dignity of work than progressives. Mm-hmm. How did that happen? And when you talk about, the struggles of making it work in low-wage jobs, is something that really lifts up the importance of individual effort, but also of family bonds and the responsibilities we have to each other. And, what do you do, and the support structures that make work possible and make family life possible and, keep people from having to work 2 or 3 jobs and leaving their kids at home to be raised by the television.
Right. And that's also a message that would, if you're into the wonky part of it, this is the sort of thing that would help build the middle class back up. And right. So, I mean, if you want the wonk part of it, you've got that.
Oh, yeah. And I think that progressives do a better job with the wonky part of explaining very earnestly, oh, you silly people, why don't you get this is good for you? Right. And I think what they're missing is, how do low-income workers see themselves, right? The heroic struggle to survive. And if you can't tell that story in the first person, no one's going to listen to the wonky solutions because it's going to come across as very condescending. And what you see is that working class voters say, well, that doesn't resonate with me because you're trying to do for me. I just want to be left alone and just try to make it on my own.
Yeah. Fascinating. Well, listen, thank you so much for doing this today. Again, the book is called The Politics of Evangelical Identity. And thanks so much for doing Blogging Heads with me, Lydia.
Thanks, Sarah. It's been a pleasure.